1,800 kilometers. That is the distance between the Ukrainian border and Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. Not the front line. Not a logistics hub 40 kilometers behind the trenches. The city in the Ural Mountains where Russia manufactures every T-90M turret currently burning on the Donbas steppe, where 3 shifts of workers under floodlights weld armor plate around the clock, where the Kremlin's generals briefed each other with quiet confidence. The Urals are untouchable. Geography is our defense. That confidence died in a single night. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What we're documenting today is not a battle in the traditional sense. There are no opposing infantry lines, no artillery duel at 15 kilometers. This is the story of a swarm of Ukrainian long-range drones that flew deeper into Russian territory than any Ukrainian weapon had ever flown before, crossed 2 Russian federal republics without being destroyed, and struck the final assembly hall of Uralvagonzavod at the exact moment the night shift was changing over. The myth of the Ural sanctuary ended before the sun rose. To understand what was at stake that night, you need to understand what Uralvagonzavad actually is, not in the abstract. In the specific, industrial, strategic sense that makes it the single most important military production facility in the Russian Federation. The plant sits on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains in the city of Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast. It was founded in 1936 as a railway car manufacturer. During the Second World War, Soviet authorities converted it to tank production inside 48 hours after Germany invaded. By the time the war ended, Uralvagonzavad had produced more than 35,000 tanks. It built the armor that rolled into Berlin. After the Soviet collapse, the plant shrank. Orders dried up. Workers went unpaid. But the facility survived. And when Russia's military modernization program accelerated through the 2010s, Uralvagonzavad became central to everything. It was designated the sole producer of the T-90M Prorev, the most advanced tank in the Russian inventory, with a welded turret, new fire control systems, a 125mm smoothbore gun with improved ammunition, and reactive armor packages designed to defeat NATO anti-tank missiles. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, Uralvagonzavad went to 3-shift operations. Production targets were raised. The facility's output directly determined how quickly Russia could replace the tanks it was losing on the front line. Ukrainian intelligence estimated that every single T-90M arriving in Donbas rolled out of the Nizhny Tagil plant, destroy the plant, slow the entire Russian armor replacement pipeline. The logic was simple. The execution was something else entirely. Which weapon could threaten a target 1,800 kilometers inside Russia? Before you answer, consider this. A HIMARS precision rockets, B-Storm Shadow cruise missiles, C long-range Ukrainian-developed drones. Which system made the Nizhny Tagil strike possible? Comment below. Ukrainian military planners had been studying Uralvagonzavad for a long time before the strike. The plant's satellite signature is unmistakable. The main assembly building measures roughly 600 meters in length. The heat signature from the forge operations is visible from orbit. The rail lines that deliver finished tanks to loading platforms run in a distinctive pattern. Intelligence analysts at Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, known as the GUR, had built a detailed picture of the facility's operational rhythm. Shift changes, supply deliveries, security patrol intervals. The location of the final assembly hall relative to the administrative buildings, which Ukrainian planners explicitly wanted to avoid. The goal was not mass casualties. The goal was precision destruction of production infrastructure. 3 months of preparatory surveillance, thermal imaging from commercial satellites, signal intelligence from the area's communication networks, cross-referenced with accounts from individuals with knowledge of the plant's layout. The picture that emerged was detailed enough to plan a strike. But the problem was not targeting. The problem was delivery. The Ukrainian Air Force's longest-range organic strike option at the time was the Storm Shadow cruise missile, supplied by the United Kingdom, with a range of approximately 250 kilometers. That puts Nizhny Tagil approximately 1,550 kilometers beyond its maximum reach. HIMARS, the American M142 rocket artillery system that had reshaped the front line, fires GMLRS rockets to a maximum of 80 kilometers and ATACMS ballistic missiles to approximately 300 kilometers. Still more than 1,500 kilometers short. Stay with me. Because what happens next reveals the weapon system that the GUR had been quietly developing for 18 months, and what it was capable of when it finally launched. The answer was drones. Not the commercial quadcopters that FPV operators fly against infantry. Not even the Shahed 136 pattern one-way attack drones that Russia had been using in swarm attacks against Ukrainian cities. Something different. Ukraine had been developing a family of long-range one-way attack drones under classified programs that became publicly known only through their operational results. By the time of the Nizhny Tagil strike, Ukrainian engineers had produced a platform with a range exceeding 1,500 kilometers, a cruising altitude that could be adjusted between low-level terrain following and higher transit profiles, a small radar cross-section achieved through composite construction and reduced metal content, and a warhead sufficient to cause serious structural damage to industrial equipment. These were not mass-produced in enormous quantities. Each airframe represented months of engineering work, precision manufacturing, and careful quality control. The decision to commit a significant number of them to a single deep strike operation against a target nearly 2,000 kilometers away was not made lightly. The planning cell that developed the operation ran through dozens of route options. The fundamental problem was Russian air defense coverage. Moscow and the surrounding region are among the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The western approaches to the Urals pass through areas with overlapping S-400 and S-300 coverage. The drone swarm could not fly the direct route. The solution was geographic. Drones launched from positions in northeastern Ukraine would fly northeast, crossing into Russian airspace over the Bryansk or Kursk regions, then turn east and transit through the Tatarstan and Bashkortostan republics before turning north towards Sverdlovsk Oblast. This route added distance but threaded through gaps in Russian radar coverage, areas where the terrain provided masking and where radar installations were spaced further apart. How many drones did Ukraine ultimately commit to the Nizhny Tagil operation? 14 drones? B-23 drones? C-31 drones? The answer comes at the end. But the number matters, because it tells you something important about how Ukraine was thinking about this strike. The drones launched in the hours after midnight. Not all at once. In sequenced waves, with departure times calculated so that drones flying the outer edges of the route would converge at the target zone simultaneously with drones on shorter inner paths. The coordination required was precise. These were not drones that could be remotely steered in real time at this range. They flew on pre-programmed routes with GPS navigation, terrain-following radar, and optical terminal guidance for the final attack run. Russian air defense tracking began picking up anomalies within the first 90 minutes of the transit. Radar operators in the Volga Federal District detected small signatures moving at low altitude. The signatures were ambiguous, possibly birds, possibly atmospheric interference, possibly something else. The operators filed reports. Those reports moved up the command chain. Here was the first critical Russian failure. The air defense network covering Russia's interior regions had been partially stripped to support operations in Ukraine and around Moscow. Permanent installations existed, but the mobile S-300 and Buk M3 batteries that would normally provide gap-filling coverage in the Ural approaches had been repositioned. The interior was thinner than it looked on a map. The second Russian failure was procedural. When the first drone was finally identified positively over Tatarstan, the intercept response was slow. Scrambled fighter aircraft arrived in the area minutes after the drone signatures had dispersed into terrain masking. The hunt was effectively over before it began. The drones flew on. At Uralvagonzavod, the night shift change was proceeding normally. Workers finishing the previous shift were gathering equipment, logging out of stations, heading toward the locker facilities at the edge of the complex. Incoming shift workers were arriving by bus at the facility gates. The assembly hall lights were at full brightness. Finished turret assemblies sat on elevated jigs along the production line, ready for morning inspection and preparation for rail loading. Security at the facility consisted of Federal Security Service personnel, internal plant guards, and a Rosgvard detachment. There were anti-drone systems. Electronic warfare equipment designed to jam GPS signals and disrupt drone navigation was mounted on the facility perimeter. Russia had been installing these systems at key industrial sites following earlier Ukrainian drone strikes on targets closer to the front line. The jamming systems activated as the drone swarm entered the final approach corridor. This was the moment the Ukrainians had prepared for, because the terminal guidance on the Ukrainian long-range drones was not GPS dependent. In the final kilometers of the attack run, the drones transitioned to optical guidance, comparing real-time camera imagery against preloaded reference images of the target. The facility's distinctive roof profile, the overhead crane rail structures visible through the skylights, the specific section of the final assembly hall where completed turrets were staged. The GPS jamming was irrelevant. The drones already knew where they were going. The first impacts came within 40 seconds of each other. What do you think? Was Ukraine right to commit this many irreplaceable long-range assets to a single deep strike, or should they have preserved the capability for multiple smaller operations? That's a genuine tactical debate. Drop your analysis in the comments. The warheads were not enormous. Each drone carried an explosive payload sufficient to destroy a vehicle or crater a hard floor. Against industrial machinery, the massive assembly jigs, the welding stations, the overhead cranes that moved turret assemblies, the effect was different. Precision destruction of critical tooling. Equipment manufactured specifically for T-90M production, built to tolerances that took years to develop, not something that could be replaced from a hardware catalog. The assembly hall took multiple direct impacts. Combat footage later verified by open-source intelligence analysts showed structural damage to the roof section above the primary assembly bays. Thermal imagery from the hours after the strike showed heat signatures consistent with multiple fires burning inside the building. At least 2 completed turret assemblies were confirmed destroyed before they could be moved. Russian emergency services responded within minutes. The Uralvagonzavad detachment went into full lockdown. Workers who had been in the shift change area were moved away from the complex. The fires burned for several hours before they were brought under control. And here is where the Kremlin faced something worse than industrial damage. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened next in the information space was as significant as what happened in the assembly hall. Russian state media's first response was silence. The strike happened. The fires burned. Workers saw them. The emergency response was visible. And for the first hours, official Russian channels said nothing. No task bulletin, no Ministry of Defense statement, nothing from the regional governor's office in Sverdlovsk Oblast. That silence was itself a signal. Russian state media moves quickly to deny or minimize Ukrainian strikes when it can. When it goes quiet, experienced observers know the damage is real and significant enough that denial would be immediately contradicted by too many witnesses. Then the videos started appearing on Russian social media. Workers at the facility, or people who claim to be workers, sharing footage of smoke columns above the main buildings. Messages in local Telegram channels describing the strike. Photographs of emergency vehicles clustered at the gates. The Russian government could not suppress what 40,000 people in Nizhny Tagil had seen in the sky. The official Russian statement, when it finally came, acknowledged a drone attack on an industrial facility in Sverdlovsk Oblast. It described the attack as a terrorist act. It claimed that air defense systems had intercepted the majority of the drones. It said that damage was minimal and production would continue. Ukrainian intelligence had anticipated this statement almost word for word. The GUR published its own assessment within 24 hours, including satellite imagery of the facility taken after the strike, showing structural changes in the assembly hall roofline and the emergency vehicle concentration at the site. By morning, Russian military bloggers. The semi-official commentator ecosystem that often carries information state media cannot, were reporting what their sources inside the region were telling them. The damage was not minimal. Multiple assembly jigs had been destroyed. The primary overhead crane in the final assembly bay was inoperative. The production line had stopped. For how long, no one outside the facility knew with certainty. Ukrainian sources estimated that complete repairs would require months. Damaged precision tooling cannot be fabricated quickly in a country under comprehensive Western sanctions that restrict access to the machine tools needed to build machine tools. Every week, the Nizhny Tagil assembly line ran at reduced capacity, was a week fewer T-90M turrets reaching the front. This was the strategic logic of the operation, not to win a single battle, to slow the entire Russian industrial capacity to replace what Ukraine was destroying on the ground. If you believe tactics win wars, type ConflictEast in the comments. The aftermath stretched beyond the physical damage. 3 days after the strike, the governor of Sverdlovsk Oblast held a press conference and spoke about the resilience of Ural industrial workers. He did not mention production numbers. He did not say when the assembly line would resume. He spoke of Ural spirit and historical strength. Russian military bloggers were less diplomatic. Several of the most widely read accounts published analyses describing the strike as a catastrophic intelligence failure. The drones had crossed 2 Russian federal republics. They had flown for hours. They had approached the Urals. And the intercept response had been inadequate. The recriminations inside the Russian security establishment were visible from the outside through telegram posts and the reassignment of several officials connected to the air defense networks in the affected regions. 2 regional air defense commanders were reportedly relieved of their positions within the weeks following the strike, according to Ukrainian intelligence sources citing intercepted communications. Russia began announcing accelerated deployment of additional air defense systems to protect interior industrial facilities. S-400 batteries were repositioned. Short-range systems were installed at Uralvagonzavod itself. Electronic warfare coverage was expanded. All of this was expensive. All of it diverted air defense resources that Russia had been using elsewhere. What would NATO have done differently with the targeting and routing of this strike? Think about the layered defense problem and the 800-kilometer range requirement. Comment your analysis below. The lessons of the Nizhny Tagil strike operate on several levels, and ConflictEast has been tracking all of them since the operation. At the tactical level, the strike showed that Ukrainian drone engineers had solved the long-range precision delivery problem in a way that Russian GPS jamming could not counter. The shift to optical terminal guidance in the final attack run was not a minor technical detail. It was the key that unlocked the Ural sanctuary. Every Russian industrial facility that had assumed GPS jamming would protect it had to reconsider that assumption. At the operational level, the strike showed that Ukrainian planners were thinking about the conflict in industrial terms. The goal was not dramatic footage of a tank exploding. The goal was constraining Russian production capacity at the source. Every T-90M that doesn't get completed is a tank that doesn't need to be destroyed on the front line. It's a gap in the Russian order of battle that cannot be filled from inventory because the inventory is the problem. At the strategic level, the collapse of the Ural sanctuary myth mattered in ways that are harder to quantify but arguably more significant. Russia's entire strategic depth argument, that its enormous territory provided inherent protection, had been the foundation of its willingness to sustain the war. The argument that Western weapons deliveries could not touch Russian territory beyond a certain depth had been central to Russian deterrent signaling. That argument died over Nizhny Tagil. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The long-range drone program was not built from a blueprint. It was built through iteration, failure, engineering creativity, and the specific necessity that comes from fighting for survival against a force with 10 times your industrial base. The engineers and operators who made the Nizhny Tagil strike possible did something that the most sophisticated military establishments in the world had not done. They built a precision strike capability from scratch, under wartime conditions, tested it operationally, and delivered it 1,800 kilometers inside hostile territory. Now for the answer to the tactical quiz from earlier, how many drones did Ukraine commit to the Nizhny Tagil operation? The answer is B, 23 drones. Not the largest number, but carefully chosen. Ukrainian planners calculated that 23 airframes, sequenced properly and routing through the identified radar gaps, gave the highest probability of achieving saturation at the target despite expected attrition from Russian intercept attempts. The routing analysis predicted that Russian intercepts would claim between 4 and 8 drones in transit, which is approximately what happened. The 15 to 19 that penetrated to the target zone were sufficient to achieve the mission objectives against the assembly hall. The choice of 23 was the difference between a mission that depleted Ukraine's irreplaceable long-range assets for marginal results and a mission that achieved strategic effect at acceptable cost. That is what makes the Nizhny Tagil strike a case study in precision resource application. Was committing 23 long-range drones to a single deep strike the right call when Ukraine had a limited inventory of these assets? Consider the alternatives. A smaller strike with less effect, preserving assets for multiple smaller operations, or waiting for even greater capability. Each approach had genuine merits and real costs. Could Russia have prevented this? The air defense gaps were known to exist. The prioritization of mobile air defense batteries toward the front line, and Moscow had left the interior thin. A commander who had predicted Ukrainian long-range drone development and repositioned accordingly might have changed the outcome. But that prediction required accepting that the Urals were not geographically immune, a belief the Russian defense establishment had not been willing to question. What would you have done differently if you were commanding the Russian air defense network covering the Ural industrial region? The resources were finite. The front line demanded coverage. The interior felt safe. Those were real constraints, not excuses. Understanding them is part of understanding how this war is actually fought. The Uralvagonzavod facility is quieter now than it was before the strike. Production has resumed in some form. Russia has not stopped making tanks. The war continues. But something changed that night that cannot be unchanged. Every Russian factory director running military production now understands that distance is no longer a guarantee. Every Russian general who briefed that the Urals were immune has had that briefing contradicted by satellite imagery. Every Russian worker at a defense plant in the deep interior now looks at the sky differently. The myth of the Ural sanctuary does not come back. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. Subscribe to ConflictEast, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The assembly hall in Nizhny Tagil is scarred, the overhead cranes repaired or replaced, the production line running again at some fraction of its previous capacity. But the wrecked turret assemblies that burned on the jigs that night are reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of invulnerability. No geography is a defense anymore. No distance is protection enough. Stay vigilant.